The scent of oil paint and turpentine had become Isabella Romano's perfume, clinging to her clothes long after she locked the gallery doors each night. She'd been 27 when her father died, leaving her nothing but a modest brownstone apartment and the Romano Gallery, a struggling art space tucked between a bookshop and an Italian restaurant on Merchant Street. Now, 6 months later, she'd learned to navigate the loneliness that came with inheriting a dying man's dreams. The gallery specialized in contemporary Italian artists, most of them unknown, all of them brilliant in ways the mainstream art world refused to acknowledge. Bella worked 16-hour days, personally greeting every visitor, explaining each piece with the passion her father had taught her, hoping that somehow, through sheer force of will, she could keep his legacy alive. That Tuesday evening in late September, Bella was cataloging a new shipment of paintings when she heard the gallery door chime, despite having locked it 20 minutes earlier. She looked up from her clipboard to find 3 men in expensive suits standing in her gallery, their presence transforming the airy, light-filled space into something suddenly claustrophobic. The man in the center commanded attention without effort. He was tall, perhaps 6'3", with dark hair swept back from a face that could have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and cold beauty. His eyes, a peculiar shade of gray-green, swept across the gallery with the assessing gaze of someone who knew exactly how much everything cost, including people. Bella's hands trembled slightly as she set down her clipboard. She'd grown up in this neighborhood long enough to recognize danger when it walked through her door wearing a $10,000 suit. The man approached her slowly, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, while his 2 companions remained stationed at the entrance like sentries. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, with just a hint of an Italian accent that suggested old-world roots despite his modern appearance. He introduced himself as Dante Moretti, and the name alone made Bella's blood run cold. Everyone in their community knew the Moretti family, whispered about them at Sunday dinners, crossed the street to avoid their businesses. They were power. They were fear. They were the shadow government that operated in the spaces the law couldn't reach. Dante explained with unsettling calm that her father had borrowed $500,000 from the Moretti family 8 years ago. The gallery had been failing then, drowning in debt, and her father had been desperate. The Morettis had offered him a lifeline with terms that seemed manageable at the time, or so Dante claimed. Her father had been paying the interest faithfully for years until 6 months ago when the payments suddenly stopped. Bella felt the room tilt slightly. Her father had never mentioned any loan, never hinted at the darkness he'd invited into their lives. She wanted to call Dante a liar, to throw him out of her gallery, but the documents he laid on her counter told a story she couldn't deny. There was her father's signature, witnessed and notarized, promising repayment in full by the time of his death or transfer of debt to his estate. Dante gave her 30 days to produce the full amount plus accumulated interest, totaling over $600,000, or forfeit the gallery. He delivered this ultimatum without malice, as if he were simply explaining the terms of a standard business transaction, which in his world, perhaps it was. Bella tried to negotiate, tried to appeal to whatever humanity might exist beneath that perfectly tailored exterior, but Dante remained unmoved. He handed her a business card with nothing but a phone number embossed in black ink, told her to call when she was ready to discuss payment arrangements, and left as smoothly as he'd arrived. The gallery suddenly felt too large and too empty, and Bella sank into her father's old desk chair, wondering how her life had collapsed so completely in the span of 15 minutes. The next 2 weeks dissolved into frantic desperation. Bella contacted every bank in the city, only to be denied loan after loan. Her credit was decent but unremarkable, her collateral insufficient, her business projections too uncertain for any legitimate lender to take the risk. She considered selling the gallery outright, but in her neighborhood's current market, she'd be lucky to get $300,000, nowhere near what she owed. She sold her mother's jewelry, or her father's watch collection, every valuable she could find in her apartment, and raised barely $40,000. Sleep became a distant memory as she lay awake each night, calculating impossible mathematics, trying to find a solution where none existed. Her younger sister Sophia noticed the change immediately. At 26, Sophia was everything Bella wasn't: bold where Bella was cautious, rebellious where Bella was dutiful, like alive with a reckless energy that both worried and fascinated Bella. Sophia had recently started dating someone new, a man named Marco, who showered her with expensive gifts and took her to exclusive clubs, when Bella finally broke down and confessed everything about the debt. Sophia's eyes lit up with what Bella mistook for concern, but was actually calculation. Sophia promised to help, said she knew people who knew people, that everything would work out. Bella wanted to believe her. I desperately needed to believe someone, so she let herself hope. On day 23, Bella called the number on Dante's card. He answered on the second ring, his voice betraying no surprise at her call, as if he'd been expecting it all along. They met the next evening at a private dining room in an upscale restaurant that Dante apparently owned. He arrived alone this time, and Bella noticed details she'd missed during their first encounter. The slight scar above his left eyebrow, the way his hands moved with controlled precision, the exhaustion that lived in his eyes despite his composed demeanor. Over untouched plates of ossobuco and risotto, Bella made her proposition. She couldn't pay the money, that much was clear, but she could work off the debt. Her father had trained her in art authentication, and she'd earned a modest reputation for identifying forgeries. She'd heard rumors, careful whispers about the Moretti family's involvement in the art underworld, moving pieces that museums and private collectors couldn't legally acquire. Dante listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, while Bella laid out her terms. She would authenticate pieces for his operations, determine provenance, identify potential forgeries before they cost him money or reputation. In exchange, her debt would decrease by $10,000 per month, plus she'd keep the gallery open with his protection against other creditors. It would take years to clear the debt completely, but it was the only path forward she could see. She expected him to laugh, to dismiss her immediately, but instead, Dante leaned back in his chair and studied her with those unsettling gray-green eyes. He asked her why she thought she could survive in his world, whether she understood what she was truly offering, if she knew the price of broken agreements. Bella met his gaze without flinching and told him she had nothing left to lose except her father's legacy, and she'd endure anything to protect that. Dante's terms were harsh but clear. She would be available whenever he called, day or night, no exceptions. She would tell no one about their arrangement, not Sophia, not friends, not even her priest. She would view pieces, authenticate them, ask no questions about where they came from or where they were going. Any betrayal, any hint of cooperation with law enforcement, any breach of confidentiality would result in the immediate foreclosure of her gallery and consequences she didn't want to imagine. Bella agreed before she could convince herself otherwise, and they shook hands across the table, sealing a deal that would entangle their lives in ways neither could predict. The work began immediately. Dante would send a car for her at odd hours, on taking her to warehouses and private estates where she'd examine paintings, sculptures, occasionally medieval manuscripts or antiquities. She developed a system, working efficiently, keeping her evaluations professional and detailed. But she couldn't help noticing things about Dante that contradicted his reputation. The way he handled each artwork with genuine reverence, how he'd pause before particularly beautiful pieces, the extensive knowledge he possessed about artistic movements and techniques. Once, while examining a disputed Caravaggio, she caught him reciting the historical context from memory, his voice carrying an unexpected passion. When their eyes met, he'd immediately shut down, his expression returning to that cold, professional mask. But Bella had seen beneath it, just for a moment. 6 weeks into their arrangement, Dante called her to the gallery after hours. Bella's heart raced as she let him in, fearing she'd made some mistake that the deal was off. Instead, he asked if she'd accompany him somewhere, offering no details, just a request that felt more like a command. They drove in silence to an elegant assisted living facility on the city's east side. Dante led her through hushed corridors to a suite where an elderly woman sat by a window, staring at the sunset. He introduced her as his mother, Lucia Moretti, and Bella watched something transform in Dante as he knelt beside his mother's chair. The harsh Mafia boss disappeared, replaced by a devoted son speaking softly in Italian, holding his mother's fragile hand with infinite gentleness. Lucia's dementia had stolen most of her present, leaving her trapped in memories that flickered like faulty lights. But when Dante opened a book of Italian poetry and began reading aloud, his mother's eyes cleared slightly and she smiled. Dante had brought Bella because Lucia had been an art teacher before the disease claimed her, and he thought perhaps looking at the gallery catalogs Bella had brought might spark some recognition, some momentary return. They spent 2 hours there, Bella showing Lucia pictures of paintings, Dante reading poetry, and the old woman occasionally murmuring appreciation or reaching out to touch the photographs with trembling fingers. As they left, Bella felt something shift inside her, a crack forming in the protective wall she'd built against Dante Moretti. Monsters didn't read poetry to their dying mothers. Monsters didn't cry when they thought no one was looking. The chapter of their lives that had begun with threats and debts was slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming something else. Bella found herself thinking about Dante during the day, wondering about the man hidden beneath the reputation, incurious about the pain that had forged him into something so hard and so lonely. She told herself it was just familiarity, just the natural result of spending time with someone, but deep down, she knew she was lying. Something was growing between them, fragile and dangerous, like a flower pushing through concrete. Then, on a cold October evening, everything shattered. Bella received a video message on her phone from an unknown number. The footage showed Sophia bound to a chair in what looked like an empty warehouse, tears streaming down her face, a man's hand roughly grabbing her hair to force her to look at the camera. The voice that accompanied the video was smooth and mocking, introducing himself as Marco Vitale. He explained that Sophia's boyfriend, the man who'd been showering her with gifts and attention, was him. He'd been using Sophia to get close to Bella, to gain leverage against Dante Moretti, his oldest and most hated enemy. His demands were simple. Bella would enter Dante's private office, photograph specific documents from his safe, and deliver them within 48 hours. If she refused, if she told Dante, if she contacted the police, Sophia would disappear forever. The video ended with Sophia screaming Bella's name, and the sound would haunt Bella's nightmares for months to come. Bella didn't sleep that night, couldn't even pretend to close her eyes. She sat on her apartment floor with her phone clutched in shaking hands, watching the video of Sophia over and over, each viewing carving deeper wounds into her heart. The sister she'd raised after their mother died, the wild, beautiful girl who'd been her only family, was terrified and alone because of Bella's entanglement with Dante Moretti. The guilt was suffocating, pressing down on her chest until each breath felt like lifting stones. Marco had calculated perfectly, had found the one pressure point that would make Bella betray the man who'd shown her unexpected gentleness, who'd shared his dying mother's final lucid moments, who'd become something dangerously close to a friend in the shadows of their strange arrangement. She had no choice, or at least that's what Bella told herself as she planned the theft. Dante had given her keys to his primary office 6 weeks ago, a brownstone in the financial district that served as the legitimate face of his operations. She knew his schedule, knew he'd be meeting with associates across town the following evening, knew where he kept his safe and had memorized the combination after watching him open it twice, her art authenticator's eye for detail serving this terrible purpose. The betrayal felt like swallowing glass, sharp and wrong, but Sophia's screams echoed louder than conscience. Bella would steal the documents, deliver them to Marco, get her sister back, and then disappear from Dante's life forever. He'd never know she'd been anything more than another person who'd used and betrayed him, and perhaps that was kinder than the truth. The next evening, Bella entered Dante's office with her hands steady despite the chaos inside her mind. The building was quiet, most of the legitimate staff gone home for the day. Only a few security personnel remaining who knew her as the art consultant and waved her through without question. She climbed the stairs to Dante's third-floor office, each step feeling like a march toward her own execution. The office was exactly as she remembered, masculine and understated, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive mahogany desk that had probably cost more than her apartment. Behind a Modigliani reproduction hung the safe, to reveal folders of documents, cash, and to reveal folders of documents, cash, and a small velvet box she didn't let herself examine. She pulled out her phone and began photographing the papers Marco had specifically requested, financial ledgers that detailed transactions between the Moretti family and various city officials, in evidence of corruption and collusion that would destroy Dante's legitimate businesses and likely send him to prison for decades. She was halfway through the stack when she heard the one sound she'd been praying against, the distinctive click of the office door opening behind her. Dante stood in the doorway, still in his suit from whatever meeting he'd supposedly been attending, his face a mask of absolute stillness that was somehow more terrifying than rage would have been. For a long moment, neither of them moved, Bella frozen with documents in hand, Dante processing the scene before him with those analytical eyes that missed nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost conversational, asking what she was doing with a tone that suggested he already knew the answer. Bella's prepared explanations died in her throat. She couldn't lie, couldn't insult them both with denials when the evidence was literally in her hands. Instead, she said nothing. He walked slowly into the room, closed the door behind him with deliberate care, and told Bella to continue photographing the documents since she'd already started. His calm was terrifying, each word delivered with surgical precision designed to cut deep. He said he'd wondered how long it would take for her to show her true nature, that everyone always betrayed him eventually, that he'd actually started to believe she might be different, which made him a fool deserving of this lesson. He told her to take everything she needed, that he wouldn't stop her, because living with the guilt of whatever consequences followed would be punishment enough. Then he sat in his desk chair and simply watched her, his expression empty. All the gentleness she'd glimpsed over the past weeks erased completely. Bella broke. The phone clattered to the floor as she collapsed to her knees, words pouring out in a desperate flood. She told him about Sophia, about Marco's video, about the ultimatum and the impossible choice she'd been forced to make. She begged him to understand that she'd never wanted this, that betraying him felt like tearing out her own heart, that she'd spent the entire day trying to find another way and failing. She showed him the video on her phone, Sophia's terrified face and Marco's mocking voice, offering it as evidence and explanation and plea all at once. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, she said, because there was no forgiveness possible for what she'd done, but she needed him to know that it wasn't about the debt or the money or anything except saving the only family she had left. Dante's expression shifted as he watched the video, the emptiness replaced by something darker and more focused. He played it 3 times, studying every frame, listening to every word Marco said. One hadn't come to him immediately, when she hadn't come to him immediately when she received the threat, and Bella almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. Because he was Dante Moretti, she said. Because involving him would have meant Sophia's immediate death. Because Marco had specifically warned her that telling Dante would result in consequences she couldn't imagine. Dante leaned forward, his eyes burning with intensity, and told her that Marco had calculated wrong. The one thing Marco didn't understand about Dante was that betraying him was forgivable under the right circumstances, but threatening someone under his protection was not. The next hours blurred into a flurry of activity that Bella barely comprehended. Dante made phone calls in rapid Italian, his voice commanding and absolute. Within 30 minutes, a dozen men had assembled in the office, including Lorenzo Ricci, Dante's second-in-command, a lean man with intelligent eyes and complete loyalty written in every action. Dante explained the situation with clinical efficiency, tracing Marco's movements over the past months, identifying the warehouse where Sophia was likely being held based on properties Marco controlled. He told Bella to wait in the office where she'd be safe, but she refused, said she wouldn't hide while her sister was in danger, that if there were consequences to be faced, she'd face them directly. Dante studied her for a long moment, then nodded once and told her to stay close to Lorenzo, to follow orders without question. That hesitation could mean death. They drove in a convoy of black SUVs through the city's industrial district, pulling up outside a warehouse that looked abandoned but showed signs of recent activity. Dante's men moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding the building, cutting off escape routes, preparing for confrontation. Dante himself approached the main entrance with Bella and Lorenzo, and when the door opened, Marco Vitale stood there with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, clearly having expected company. The warehouse interior was massive and mostly empty, with Sofia tied to a chair in the center, guarded by 4 of Marco's men. Marco congratulated Bella on her obedience, said he hadn't expected her to follow through quite so completely. That loyalty to family was such a predictable weakness to exploit. He taunted Dante about getting soft, about letting some art curator blind him to obvious manipulation, about how easy it had been to use Sofia as bait. Dante remained silent, his expression unreadable, until Marco finally named his real price for Sofia's release. He wanted the documents Bella had photographed, plus Dante's withdrawal from 3 key territories the families had been fighting over for years, plus a formal acknowledgement of Marco's superiority delivered before the 5 family heads. Dante agreed to everything. His easy capitulation surprised everyone, including Lorenzo, who shifted uneasily beside Bella. Dante said he'd deliver the documents in terms immediately, that Sofia could be released unharmed, that this war between them could finally end. He walked forward slowly, pulling a flash drive from his pocket containing the photographed documents, holding it out to Marco with an extended hand. Marco approached confidently, reaching for the drive, and in that moment of trust, everything exploded into chaos. Dante grabbed Marco's wrist, twisting hard, while simultaneously his men moved on Marco's guards. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the enclosed space, and Bella screamed as Lorenzo shielded her body with his own, pushing her to the ground behind a metal support beam. The confrontation lasted less than 3 minutes, but felt eternal. When the smoke cleared and the ringing in Bella's ears finally subsided, Marco's men were subdued or dead. Marco himself was on his knees with Dante's gun pressed against his temple, and Sofia was free, sobbing as one of Dante's men cut her restraints. But Lorenzo was bleeding, a bullet having caught his shoulder as he'd protected Bella, his face pale but determined as he insisted he was fine. Dante looked at his wounded friend, then at Marco, and Bella saw murder in his eyes. But instead of pulling the trigger, Dante made a different choice. He told Marco that killing him would be mercy, and mercy was something Marco didn't deserve. Instead, Dante would expose him to the 5 families. Gin would reveal evidence he'd been collecting for months about Marco's dealings with federal agents, about his willingness to betray every code the families held sacred in exchange for immunity. Marco's face went white because in their world, being branded an informant was worse than death. It meant exile, meant losing all protection, meant living with the knowledge that any family member could kill you on sight without consequence. Dante dragged Marco to his feet and threw him toward the warehouse exit, telling him he had 48 hours to leave the city and never return, that if he was spotted after that deadline, his life was forfeit. Marco stumbled away, his empire crumbling in a single evening, and Bella realized she'd just witnessed a punishment more devastating than any bullet could have delivered. The aftermath unfolded in a private hospital where Dante had connections, doctors who asked no questions and reported no gunshot wounds. Lorenzo underwent surgery to remove the bullet from his shoulder while Bella sat with Sofia in a private room, holding her sister as she cried, apologizing over and over for being so blind, for not seeing Marco's manipulation until it was too late. Sofia clung to Bella and whispered that she'd been so scared, that she thought she was going to die, that all she'd wanted was to see her sister one more time. They stayed like that for hours until Sofia finally fell asleep from exhaustion and Bella gently extracted herself to find Dante. He was standing outside Lorenzo's recovery room, staring through the window at his unconscious friend with an expression of profound guilt. Bella approached slowly, unsure of her welcome, unsure if saving Sofia balanced against the betrayal, or if she'd destroyed whatever fragile trust had been building between them. When Dante finally acknowledged her presence, he spoke without looking away from Lorenzo. He said that Lorenzo had a wife and 2 young children, that he'd taken a bullet protecting someone who'd just tried to betray Dante, that this was the cost of the life Dante had created. Bella wanted to apologize again, to explain again, but she knew words were insufficient for what had happened. Instead, she stood beside Dante in silence, both of them keeping vigil over a wounded friend. with both of them processing the violence and fear and impossible choices of the past 24 hours. Eventually, Dante began talking, his voice quiet and distant, telling Bella things he'd apparently never told anyone. He spoke about his father, a hard man who'd ruled the Moretti family with an iron fist until Marco's father had orchestrated his assassination when Dante was 16. He described being thrown into leadership before he was ready, having to prove himself through brutality when all he'd wanted was to study art history at university. He explained that every decision he'd made since then had been about survival and protection, about keeping his mother safe, about honoring his father's memory by not letting the family fall apart. Dante told Bella that he'd never wanted this life, that he'd tried to leave once when he was 19. Torn had packed a bag and made it as far as the airport before Lorenzo called to say his mother had suffered a breakdown upon hearing he was abandoning the family. He'd come back, had accepted his role, had become the man everyone expected him to be while burying the person he'd wanted to become. The art collection he'd shown Bella weeks ago represented every dream he'd sacrificed, pieces he acquired not for investment, but for the brief moments of beauty they offered in an otherwise dark existence. He said all of this without self-pity, just stating facts, and Bella understood that he was explaining why her betrayal had cut so deep, because she'd represented the possibility of someone seeing past the monster to the man underneath. Morning found them still in the hospital, Lorenzo awake and recovering, Sofia being evaluated by a trauma counselor, and Bella and Dante drinking terrible coffee in a waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and grief. Dante told Bella that he was calling a meeting of the 5 family heads, that he was going to publicly forgive her debt and formally declare Marco persona non grata for his betrayal. He said she'd be free, that the gallery would be protected, that she could return to her normal life without any further obligation to him or his world. It was everything Bella had wanted when this nightmare began, complete freedom and safety. But hearing the words felt like being told she'd survived, but lost something irreplaceable in the process. 2 days later, Bella stood in a private room at an upscale restaurant while Dante met with the leaders of the city's 5 major families. She wasn't present for the meeting itself, but Lorenzo, arm in a sling and looking exhausted, explained what was happening. Dante presented evidence of Marco's cooperation with federal agents, on documents that proved Marco had been prepared to sacrifice all 5 families to avoid prosecution. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled leaders because their entire society was built on codes of silence and loyalty. Marco was formally exiled, his assets seized and distributed, his name struck from all family records. Then Dante made a personal declaration, stating that Isabella Romano's debt was forgiven in full, that she was under the permanent protection of the Moretti family, and that any action against her or her sister would be considered an action against Dante personally. When Dante emerged from the meeting, Bella was waiting. She thanked him for everything, for saving Sofia, for forgiving the debt, for giving her back her life. She told him she'd never forget what he'd done, that despite everything, she was grateful their paths had crossed. Dante accepted her words with a slight nod, maintaining that professional distance, and Bella realized he was letting her go, was opening the cage door and allowing her to fly away. It was the kindest thing he could have done, the most selfless gift he could have offered, and it broke her heart in ways the threats and fear never had. They parted outside the restaurant, Bella walking one direction toward her normal life, Dante walking another toward his dark kingdom, and neither of them looked back because looking back would have made leaving impossible. 3 months felt like 3 years. Bella had packed up her life with Sofia's help, closed the gallery temporarily with plans to reopen once she'd processed everything, and moved to Harbor City, a smaller coastal town 2 hours away, where she'd accepted a curator position at a respected contemporary art museum. The job was everything she'd once dreamed about, stable and prestigious, working with talented artists and educated patrons who discussed brushwork and composition instead of debts and territories. Sofia had stayed in the old neighborhood, attending therapy twice a week and slowly rebuilding her confidence. But they spoke every day, maintaining the bond that had been forged even stronger through shared trauma. Bella's new apartment overlooked the harbor, and she'd filled it with light and plants, creating a sanctuary that felt nothing like her old life. Her coworkers were kind, her schedule was predictable, and she went to sleep each night without fear of mysterious phone calls or dangerous errands. It was everything she'd told herself she wanted, safe and normal and uncomplicated. So she couldn't explain why she felt hollow, why she'd catch herself staring at her phone hoping for messages that never came, why every dark-haired man in an expensive suit made her heart jump before disappointment settled in. She tried to convince herself it was just adjustment, just the natural process of recovering from sustained stress. But late at night when she couldn't sleep, she'd admit the truth. She missed Dante Moretti with an intensity that frightened her. She'd think about the way he'd handled his mother with infinite gentleness, how he'd listened to Bella explain paintings with genuine interest, the rare moments when his guard dropped, and she'd glimpse the art history student he'd once dreamed of being. She'd remember standing beside him in the hospital, keeping vigil over Lorenzo, feeling more herself in that moment of shared vulnerability than she had in months of safety. Bella had spent years building walls around her heart after her father's death, protecting herself from loss and pain. And somehow Dante had slipped through those defenses without either of them noticing until it was too late. She'd told herself she hated him, feared him, tolerated him out of necessity, but the truth was far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. Meanwhile, Dante was dismantling his life piece by piece. Lorenzo watched with concern as his friend and boss systematically began legitimizing family operations, selling off illegal enterprises, investing heavily in legal businesses, creating distance between the Moretti name and the criminal activities that had sustained them for generations. The other family heads noticed and whispered about weakness, about Dante going soft, but he weathered their criticism with the same impassive expression he'd perfected over years of leadership. He told Lorenzo it was strategic, that law enforcement attention was intensifying, that adapting was survival, but Lorenzo knew his friend well enough to see through the lies. The truth was that Dante couldn't continue living a life that had driven away the only person who'd made him want to be better. Bella had looked at him like he was human, had sat with his dying mother and shown genuine compassion, had been brave enough to work off her father's debt rather than run or break. Even her betrayal had been motivated by love for her sister. And Dante had spent enough time around genuine monsters to recognize that Bella's temporary weakness was more forgivable than most people's everyday cruelty. He threw himself into work, into change, into anything that might distract him from the emptiness that had taken up permanent residence in his chest. But nothing helped. His mother's apartment felt unbearably empty. His art collection offered no solace. And even Lorenzo's attempts at friendship bounced off the walls Dante had rebuilt around himself. Then Lucia Moretti's health took a dramatic turn. The dementia that had been slowly stealing her away accelerated suddenly, and doctors told Dante she likely had weeks, maybe days left. He spent every available moment at her bedside, reading poetry and playing old Italian music, watching helplessly as the woman who'd raised him alone after his father's death slipped further into confusion. In one of her increasingly rare, lucid moments, Lucia gripped Dante's hand with surprising strength and asked about the girl with kind eyes, the one who'd visited and talked about paintings. Dante tried to deflect, but his mother fixed him with a look that could still cut through all his defenses and told him that life was too short to live in fear, that she'd rather he choose happiness over duty for once, that she wanted to die knowing her son had found someone who saw the good in him. Dante made the phone call before he could talk himself out of it. When Bella answered, her voice breathless with surprise, he explained about his mother's declining health, about Lucia asking for her, about hoping Bella might visit one last time if she was willing. He kept his tone neutral, professional, giving her every opportunity to refuse without guilt. But Bella didn't hesitate. She said she'd be there the next day, that she'd want to say goodbye to Lucia regardless of everything else, that some debts had nothing to do with money. Dante felt something crack in his chest at her immediate agreement, at the kindness she still extended despite having every reason to want nothing to do with his world. Bella arrived at the care facility the following afternoon, and the sight of her standing in the doorway made Dante forget how to breathe for a moment. She looked different somehow, more confident maybe, or perhaps just rested in ways she'd never been while working off her debt. But her eyes were sad, and when their gazes met, he saw the same hollowness he'd been carrying, the same sense of having lost something irreplaceable. They greeted each other carefully, maintaining distance, being excruciatingly polite in ways that felt wrong after everything they'd been through together. Then they entered Lucia's room, and the dying woman's face lit up with recognition, despite the confusion that usually clouded her features now. For 3 hours, they sat with Lucia, Bella showing her photographs of paintings from the museum, Dante reading poetry, both of them sharing stories that made the old woman smile. Lucia drifted in and out of clarity, sometimes thinking Bella was her younger sister, sometimes recognizing her as the art consultant, occasionally forgetting everyone entirely and talking to people only she could see. But in one crystalline moment of absolute lucidity, Lucia took both their hands and placed them together, and telling them in Italian that love was the only thing worth fighting for, that she'd watched her son build walls around his heart for years, that seeing those walls crack because of Bella was the best gift she could have received before dying. Lucia Moretti passed away peacefully that evening with Dante and Bella, each holding one of her hands, her final breaths coming softly, while Dante whispered that he loved her and that she could rest now. Bella stayed through it all. Had been made, and the facility staff had been made, and the facility staff had respectfully withdrawn. Dante and Bella sat in Lucia's empty room and finally allowed themselves to grieve, not just for the woman they'd lost, but for all the losses they'd accumulated, all the might-have-beens that would never be. The funeral took place on a gray Tuesday that perfectly matched the mood of gathered mourners. All 5 family heads attended, paying respects to the woman who'd been the matriarch of their society, who'd held the Moretti family together after her husband's assassination and raised a son capable of commanding respect and fear in equal measure. Bella stood at the back of the church, not wanting to intrude on family grief, but Dante had spotted her immediately and insisted she sit with the family in the front pew beside Lorenzo and his wife. During the service, when Dante delivered the eulogy, his voice cracked only once when he mentioned his mother's dying wish that he choose happiness over obligation for once in his life. After the burial, after the reception, after all the obligations of death had been satisfied, Dante found Bella standing alone in the cemetery, looking at Lucia's fresh grave. He approached slowly, giving her space to leave if she wanted, but she turned toward him instead, tears streaming down her face, and told him she was so sorry, that Lucia had been remarkable, that the world was dimmer without her light. Dante said that his mother had liked Bella immediately, had told him after that first visit that Bella had old soul eyes, and that he should be careful not to let her slip away. They stood together in the fading daylight. 2 people who'd been circling each other for months and finally acknowledged what they'd both been avoiding. Dante spoke first, his words careful and measured, saying that he'd spent the past 3 months trying to become someone worthy of her, that he'd been systematically removing himself from the darkness that had defined his life, that he couldn't promise to be perfect, but he could promise to choose her every day if she'd give him the chance. Bella listened with her heart pounding, hearing the vulnerability in his confession, understanding what it cost a man like Dante Moretti to admit need and want and hope. She told him that she'd run to Harbor City trying to convince herself she wanted safety and normalcy, but the truth was she'd been miserable, that every morning she'd wake up thinking about him, that she'd fallen in love with him somewhere between authentication jobs and hospital vigils, and she couldn't unfeel it no matter how logical leaving had been. The kiss happened naturally, inevitably, both of them moving together like magnets finally released from opposing forces. It was gentle and desperate simultaneously, tasting like grief and hope, and 3 months of longing finally acknowledged. When they broke apart, Bella was laughing and crying simultaneously, overwhelmed by the impossibility and rightness of this moment, this man, this future she'd convinced herself she couldn't have. Dante rested his forehead against hers and promised that he'd protect her always, that she'd never have to fear his world because he was actively dismantling the parts that had caused her pain, that he'd spend every remaining day earning the gift of her trust. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of intense conversation and careful rebuilding. Bella extended her leave from the museum, citing family emergency, which wasn't entirely untrue given that she was navigating the complicated process of integrating into Dante's life properly. She met with Lorenzo and his wife Maria, who welcomed her warmly and joked that it was about time Dante found someone capable of humanizing him. She had dinner with the other family heads' wives, a terrifying experience that became less frightening when they shared stories about their own unconventional entries into this world. She spent hours with Dante planning their future, discussing boundaries and expectations and dreams they'd both thought lost. Dante was true to his word about legitimizing operations. Within a month, he'd divested from 3 major criminal enterprises, transferring ownership to other families or shutting down operations entirely. He invested heavily in legitimate businesses, art galleries and restaurants and real estate development, building an empire that could withstand legal scrutiny. Weathered all criticism with Bella beside him, her presence somehow making everything else tolerable. 2 months after Lucia's funeral, Dante took Bella to a private island he owned off the coast, a place he'd purchased years ago as an escape, but rarely visited because solitude only amplified his loneliness. The island was beautiful, lush and green with white sand beaches and a modest villa overlooking the ocean. They spent 3 days there, swimming and cooking and talking about everything and nothing, existing in a bubble separate from family obligations and societal expectations. On the 3rd night, as they sat on the beach watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, Dante told Bella he'd been practicing a speech for weeks, but had forgotten every word now that the moment had arrived. Instead of eloquence, he offered honesty. He told her that she'd seen him at his worst, cold and threatening and dangerous, but had somehow found something worth loving anyway. He said that she'd become essential to him, that waking up without her felt incomplete, that he wanted to spend whatever time he had left trying to deserve her faith in him. He pulled out a simple ring, no flashy diamond or ostentatious display, just a platinum band with a small sapphire that matched her eyes. He asked her to marry him not because it made strategic sense or satisfied family expectations, but because the idea of a future without her felt unbearable. Because she made him want to be the man he'd abandoned at 16, because she was the only person who'd ever looked at him and seen someone worth saving. Bella said yes before he finished speaking, laughing and crying simultaneously, tackling him into the sand and kissing him with all the joy and relief and love she'd been holding inside. Could have a small wedding, or a large one, imagining a future that had seemed impossible months ago. Dante told her they could have a small wedding or a large one, whatever she preferred, that he'd marry her in a courthouse or a cathedral or on this beach, if that's what she wanted. Bella said she wanted something intimate, just family and close friends, a celebration of the love they'd fought so hard to claim, rather than a spectacle for society. Dante agreed immediately, saying he'd marry her tomorrow if she'd let him. That waiting felt like torture now that she'd agreed. They married 6 weeks later in a renovated chapel on the outskirts of the city. The building small and intimate with stained glass windows that painted rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. Sophia stood as Bella's maid of honor, tears streaming down her face as she watched her sister marry the man who'd saved her life and captured Bella's heart. Lorenzo, shoulder fully healed, stood as Dante's best man, grinning widely at seeing his friend finally experience happiness, uncomplicated by duty or obligation. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. Traditional vows exchanged with voices that trembled with emotion, rings slipped onto fingers with hands that shook slightly. When the priest pronounced them married and Dante kissed Bella, the small gathering erupted in applause and cheers. Dante was crying openly, making no attempt to hide his emotions. And Bella held his face in her hands and told him she loved him, that she'd choose him every day for the rest of their lives, that they were going to build something beautiful together. The reception took place in the gallery, which Bella had reopened under new name, Lucia's Legacy. The space had been transformed with flowers and lights, serving as the perfect venue for celebrating love in a place dedicated to beauty and memory. The year that followed exceeded every dream Bella had dared to imagine. She split her time between the museum in Harbor City and the gallery in the city, Dante having purchased a beautiful home in Harbor City so she could maintain her career without compromise. He continued legitimizing operations, building business empire that operated entirely within legal bounds, using his intelligence and strategic thinking for construction and development rather than crime. The other families gradually accepted his transition, recognizing that law enforcement scrutiny was intensifying and Dante's approach might be survival rather than weakness. Lorenzo stepped up to handle day-to-day operations, freeing Dante to focus on building the life he'd always wanted. Sophia thrived under the protection and support of the Moretti family, attending art school and slowly healing from her trauma. She and Lorenzo's younger brother began dating, a relationship that developed naturally and brought joy to both families. Sophia credited Bella with saving her life twice, once from Marco's warehouse and once from the darkness that had threatened to consume her afterward. But Bella always corrected her, saying they'd saved each other, that family meant showing up even when everything seemed hopeless. The gallery became a cornerstone of the community, featuring emerging artists and hosting educational programs for underprivileged children, honoring Lucia's memory by making art accessible to everyone. Bella found deep satisfaction in this work, in seeing young people discover their creative voices, in knowing that her father's legacy had transformed into something larger than either of them had imagined. Dante often stopped by during exhibitions, and Bella loved watching him interact with artists, his extensive knowledge and genuine passion evident in every conversation. One evening, 14 months after their wedding, Bella and Dante stood in the gallery during an opening reception for a talented young sculptor. Bella's hand rested on her small but visible baby bump, their first child expected in 4 months, and Dante couldn't stop touching her stomach reverently, amazed that they were creating life together. Across the room, Sophia laughed with Lorenzo's brother while Lorenzo and Maria supervised their own children running between sculptures with the fearless enthusiasm of the young. Dante wrapped his arms around Bella from behind, pulling her close, kissing her temple with infinite tenderness. He asked if she had any regrets, if she ever wished she'd run further and faster when she had the chance. Bella turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd once terrified her and now completed her, seeing all the love and hope and determination in his gray-green eyes. She told him she regretted nothing, that every choice she'd made had led to this moment, that he was her obsession in the best possible way. She reminded him of the words he'd spoken that first night in his office when she'd proposed working off her debt, how he'd asked if she understood what she was offering, and she laughed, saying she'd understood better than either of them realized, that she'd been offering her heart without knowing it. They kissed as the gallery filled with conversation and laughter, surrounded by art and family and the future they'd built from ashes and impossibility. Dante whispered against her lips that loving her had saved him, had given him purpose beyond survival and violence, that their child would grow up knowing a father who chose light over darkness because of one brave woman who'd seen past his reputation to the man underneath. Bella replied that he'd saved her too, had shown her that safety wasn't the same as living, that the greatest loves often began in the most unlikely places. The gallery lights sparkled like stars, illuminating paintings and sculptures that represented dreams made tangible through effort and vision. Bella and Dante stood at the center of it all, proof that transformation was possible, that love could bloom even in the darkest soil, that choosing each other every day was the greatest adventure either could imagine. Their story had begun with threats and debts and fear, but it had become something transcendent, something worth every risk and sacrifice. They'd found their obsession in each other, and in doing so, had discovered that the most powerful force in any world, legitimate or otherwise, was choosing love even when logic said to run, standing together even when everything said to hide, and building beauty in spaces that had only known darkness. If you enjoyed Crimson Debts, please like, subscribe, and share this story with fellow romance lovers. What did you think of Dante and Bella's journey? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Should I create more Mafia romance stories? Let me know what you'd like to hear next. Until then, remember, the greatest love stories are the ones where two people choose each other against all odds. Stay romantic, stay passionate, and I'll see you in the next story.